Hello and welcome to another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. It's the Democracy Day edition. Our guest is Ann Nelson, author and research scholar focusing on media analysis at the Saltzman Institute at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. My name is Neil Parekh, and I am the executive producer and guest host of the show. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. We're also live on Ann's Twitter account. Thank you so much, Ann, for letting us go live on your channels. You're on your channel. Please let us know where you're watching from. Please like, comment, share, retweet, tag a friend, let them know about this very special show that we're doing today. Again, we're going to be focusing on Democracy Day, an effort to push back against the threats to our democracy and a free press. You'll learn all about that later in the show. We'll also talk to Ann about her work and some of the writing that she has done, particularly her book, Shadow Network. But first, what we'd like to do is to give you a little preview of what's to come in today's show.
This week on Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along, our guest is Ann Nelson, an author and lecturer in the fields of international affairs, media, and human rights at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Ann is the author of several books, including Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. This week, we focus our attention on a nationwide effort to shine a light on threats to democracy and a free press here in the United States. As our American democracy inches closer to a possible breakdown in 2024, the magnitude of that threat isn't well understood and is not being taken seriously enough. In some cases, elected officials are part of the anti-democratic efforts and aren't being held accountable. It's time for journalists and others to step up and do more. Democracy Day is an effort to draw attention to this crisis, provide the public with the context and information they need, and bring all types of media together to sound the alarm. Partners in this effort include several prominent news organizations and groups like the Center for Cooperative Media, the Center for Public Integrity, Neiman Reports, Neiman Foundation, Online News Association, San Francisco Public Press, Society for Professional Journalists, Solutions Journalism Network, and several hundred others. Sri Srinivasan is our host. I am the executive producer and occasional guest host, Neil Parekh. Paula Kiger helps produce the show, engaging with the audience on Facebook and LinkedIn. Sri has been hosting the New York Times Read Along for almost 7 years, with some amazing guests. The show is produced by Digimentors. We produce high-quality virtual and hybrid events for organizations big and small around the world. We also do social and digital consulting, training, and workshops. Again, Ann Nelson is our guest, live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website.
That's a little bit of a preview of what's to come. We're certainly excited for today's show. Let's go ahead and welcome some of the folks who are watching today. We have Patricia Freudenberg watching from New York. Thank you, Patricia. We have my mom watching from Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. You didn't think I wouldn't wave. Hi, Mom. How you doing? Yes, it's my weekly wave to my mom. I want to assure everyone that I do talk to her too. I don't only talk to her through the read-along. Diane Stefani is watching from Sedona, Arizona. Early for you out there. Diane, thank you so much for getting up. She wants to ask Ann what she thinks of CNN getting rid of reliable sources. We will certainly ask Ann about that when she joins the show. Miriam Berkeley is watching from Hell's Kitchen, New York. Thank you, Miriam. Always great to see you. My neighbor here in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, Pradnya Haldapur, is watching from Silver Spring, Maryland. Pradnya, great to have you. Ken Fisher is watching from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Ken, thank you so much. And Pradnya has mentioned that, good Lord, 7 years. Yes, we are approaching the 7-year mark for Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. October is when he started the show 7 years ago, 2015. Jay Pulaski is watching from Maryland. Jay, watching on Facebook. Thank you so much. Ellen is watching from the Upper East Side. Our democracy is obviously broken down, no question. I think that's something that most people wouldn't argue with, Ellen. The question is really, what do we do about it? And I know that Anne has been working on this, writing about this, researching this for a number of years. She has some thoughts on the matter. Stephen Kaplan is watching from Ramsey, New Jersey. Good morning, Stephen. How are you? And yes, this is a very important show. Want to give a shout out to Paula Kiger, our producer. She's engaging with the audience on LinkedIn and YouTube. She'll share links to articles, links to Anne's work, her website, etc. So thank you for that. We have a hello from a previous guest. Julie Shelfo is watching on LinkedIn and says hi to Anne. So we'll make sure that Anne sees that when she comes on. Julie, thank you so much. It's great to have you back. We really appreciate it. Again, we're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. I want to give a quick shout out also to Zaheda Mohammed Salami. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. My apologies if I tripped on that. But Zaheda is saying hi from Astoria. So thank you, Zaheda. So what we want to do is to give you a quick tour of the New York Times and look at the front page sections of each of the papers, each of the front pages of each of the sections, rather. And then after that, we will bring Anne on the screen. So let's go ahead and do that tour real quick. We will bring that on in just a moment. Let's see if we can bring that back. There we go. There is the New York Times, and I'll step over to the paper. Right on the front page of the paper, this very important story. And in fact, Tom Jolly, the print editor, emailed me after I put out the announcements for yesterday's show by email that our timing was great. Their display story, Democracy Challenged, Twin Threats to Governing Ideals Put America in Uncharted Territory. Certainly something to take a close look at. His story is by David Leonhardt, who is a longtime writer for the Times. He's actually from my hometown of Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. He went to a different high school, but he is from my hometown. And there I see that we lost the newspaper. So sorry about that. We will bring that back on. Not sure why it dropped out, but we will keep paying attention to that. So let's go ahead and take a look at what else is on the front page. The lead stories: U.S. reluctant as Ukraine asked to upgrade arms, and another story about Ukraine, how Donbass became cradle of European war. So obviously we're having some issues with the newspaper, so we will switch and go to the cell phone. And I have to switch the angle on the cell phone. So give me one moment. We will do that. And there we go. That's the newspaper. Always have a backup plan, right? So here is the second half, bottom half of the paper. Hispanic voters still lean blue, poll concludes. City that never sleeps now nods off a bit early. And on the right, bottom right, potent new boosters are here. Will weary Americans bother? I can assure you that I am going to bother. Pam and I already have our COVID booster scheduled for next Friday. So that's the front page of the paper. We'll set that aside. Sunday Opinion, I thought was really interesting. It's a story, how far should we go to save a species? As scientists push the frontiers of conservation technology, some of their initiatives raise ethical questions. I was particularly interested in the graphic design this is it seems like it's clearly, obviously, a number of pandas, and probably like just a few pandas that they photoshopped together, but they left it on a transparent PNG, which is really interesting. That if you can see the check mark in the back, I just thought that was neat. Sunday Business. Here is the front page and the headline underneath. When eBay's boss said, "Take her down," the victims of a bizarre cyber stalking operation are trying to hold the company responsible. And LinkedIn has turned into a place for oversharing. Uh-oh. This isn't Facebook users' gripe. Others value talking about more than work. There's that lead. I'll share that I actually don't put as much on LinkedIn as I would like. I used to be much more active on LinkedIn. And recently I shared two personal pictures. One for our 20th anniversary. My wife and I celebrated 20 years back at the end of August. And I think I also shared Emily's first day of school picture on LinkedIn as a rare personal post. Those posts did much better than anything I put on LinkedIn in recent memory. So that's something to think about. I'd be curious to hear in the comments whether folks do personal posts on LinkedIn or keep it strictly business. Sunday Styles, a gentleman indeed. Will Welch, the editor of GQ, is remaking his magazine and fleshing out the meaning of the new masculinity as the culture demands that men change. That's interesting. It's a nice picture. We'll show the full front page here. You can see him lounging at home, and not the rare back of the hand tattoo. I don't think I've seen that very often. Can't quite tell what this is. Want nothing, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the German, but Hallo Hamilton, a team of translators, created a German version of the hit musical. It wasn't easy. Any Hamilton fans out there? I know Sri makes the references when he's at home and he can look across the river. Everything's legal in New Jersey. They have translations. I want to be in the room where it happens. And Peggy, and I am not throwing away my shot. Interesting. Very interesting. The book review, personal references, the narrator of How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water by Angie Cruz unburdens her life story to a career counselor. We'll take a look at that later. And apropos of our discussion, if you saw in the video, one of the challenges in terms of the threats to our democracy are politicians who are part of the problem. And Ron DeSantis is the poster child, literally, on the front page of the magazine. And it's interesting they use that. They covered Donald Trump's picture with his. Is Ron DeSantis the future of the Republican Party? Certainly worth taking a close look at. And then the T magazine this month, men's fashion, young, queer, gifted, and Black. Art, desire, friendship, and confrontation. A conversation 3 decades after Marlon Riggs's groundbreaking film, Tongues Untied. So there is the T magazine. So we'll go ahead and put the paper back in its place. We'll get back to it in just a moment. And now we'll turn our attention. We'll bring, let's see if we can get the paper right. We'll bring our guest, Ann Nelson, onto the program. Ann, of course, is an author and research scholar on media analysis at the Saltzman Institute at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. With that, let's bring on Ann Nelson.
Good morning, Neil.
Ann, good morning. How are you doing? Great to see you.
Well, it's quite a news diet today.
Quite a bit. I mean, that display story, and we'll take a closer look at that later, but that piece by David Leonhardt, when you look inside, there are 4 full pages inside. Yep. With charts and graphs and pictures. So we'll definitely want to dig into that. But first of all, thank you for joining us this morning. And we always appreciate when our guests give up some of their Sunday morning to be with us on our show. The first thing I'd like to ask you is, and we've asked this of every guest, and I really don't know when we would stop asking, because I don't know when COVID is going to go away, if it will go away. But we do ask our guests, it's been 2.5 years now. Can you share with us what your experience over the last 2.5 years has been with COVID in terms of your health, family, how you managed over the last 2.5 years,
Sure.
et cetera? Please.
Yeah, well, I was in New York City the whole time. And initially it hit very hard. I lost two friends who were just extraordinary women writers, Patricia Bosworth and Gail Sheehan, very early on. And that was hard. April, as New Yorkers know, that first April was hellish. I live on Riverside Drive, and so I would hear the ambulances going sometimes every 5 minutes. And my husband and I took a walk up to Columbia, where I have worked for over 20 years, and there was a white refrigerator morgue truck parked a block from my office, which is just not what you want to see. As the time wore on, our lives took a different rhythm, and we ended up walking miles and miles a day because suddenly we lived a kind of life where you could do that in isolation. And later, I was selected to take part in the Pfizer vaccine trials. So I was among the first 40,000 people to get a Pfizer vaccine. I was lucky in getting to be part of the vaccine part rather than the placebo. So that was very interesting. And I wrote some articles. I write for the Times Literary Supplement in London as well. And I wrote about my life as a guinea pig. And then as we went along, I became an outspoken advocate for vaccines. And then I found that the Council for National Policy was promoting a COVID disinformation campaign, discouraging people from getting vaccines and hawking fake cures like ivermectin, which is still going on apace. So I've worked with Nick Sawyer and a group of extraordinary physicians in California to try to counteract this murderous disinformation campaign, which is really responsible for, I believe, hundreds of thousands of lives.
Sure.
So yes, I've been all about the vaccine. I loosened up my restrictions this spring and was clobbered with Omicron.
Wow.
In May, but having been double vaxxed and double boosted, and then having Paxlovid on account of my age, I escaped fairly lightly and immediately got the Omicron vaccine as soon as it was available last week.
Good. I want to, before we go into, you mentioned the Council for National Policy, and we want to dig into that since that's been the centerpiece of your work for a number of years. We do want to offer our condolences on the two losses that you mentioned, and Patricia Freudenberg expresses condolences as well. So thank you for sharing that. And Patricia adds, thank you for sharing your sentiments. I know that New York was hit hard, and people can resonate with that loss, and people who live there, the sound of the ambulances every night, it was a lot. But it's the fact that you were part of the trial and was able to get the vaccine, is also good news in that sense, and we're glad.
Well, some listeners may be aware that I wrote a play after September 11th called The Guys.
Yeah.
That's still in a production 20 years later, and was a movie with Sigourney Weaver and Anthony LaPaglia. And I became, in some ways, part of a public mourning for the over 3,000 people who died on September 11th. But this year, I think of the over 300,000 people who've died unnecessarily of COVID, because of these disinformation campaigns and the various forms of disinformation that are going through our society. And I just wish that people would focus with appropriate intensity on the loss of life that is 100 times greater than what it was then.
Before we dig in, there are several people that have joined us so far. Carol King is watching from Tampa Bay. And Carol, thank you so much for your help in putting the show together. Carol is a journalist and effectively worked as an associate producer for this week's show, helping with the content and also putting us in touch with Anne. So Carol, thank you so much. Hats off to you. Pradnya is saying, I'm going to say this on repeat, please vote and encourage others to vote, especially young people and people of color. Absolutely, Pradnya. Couldn't agree with you more. And on a lighter note, she'd pay to have a cloned mini panda, a reference to that cover of the Sunday Opinion. Paula is raising her hands for all the Hamilton fans out there. And our friend Rose Horowitz is watching from Connecticut. Yes, a packed show with a great guest, and she's also interested to hear more about U.S. Democracy Day. We will certainly get to that a little bit later. But Anne, you mentioned the Council for National Policy. I want to bring up the book that you wrote, Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. Just so people have a sense of kind of the importance of this book. Timothy Snyder, author of On Tyranny, said, reveals a political trend that threatens both our form of government and our species. That's pretty intense. Nancy McLean, author of Democracy in Chains, riveting. Want to understand how so many Americans turned against truth? Read this book. And here's the background. In 1981, emboldened by Ronald Reagan's election, a group of some 50 Republican operatives, evangelicals, oil barons, and gun lobbyists. It's almost like the cast from Thank You for Smoking, if you saw that movie, and all the bad lobbyists out there met in Washington's suburb to coordinate their attack on civil liberties and the social safety net. They called their coalition the Council for National Policy. And then, skipping ahead a little bit, in a time of stark and growing threats to our most valued institutions and democratic freedoms, Shadow Network is essential reading. That's the book that you wrote a couple of years ago, I think now. Was it 2017? Was the date on it, or
2019?
2019.
It came out, but I had been working on it for several years earlier, obviously.
And it references, it's based about the Council for National Policy, which you referenced in your opening remarks. Can you tell us a little bit more about the council and the role they play, the work that they've been doing?
Sure. Well, the story really began for me some years ago. I'm from Oklahoma and had been driving around visiting family and came across these fundamentalist radio stations that were really delivering a very extreme political message, that Democrats were demons and the son of Satan. And I thought it was a local phenomenon, but just tucked it away in the back of my reporter's head, which I do. And fast forward to election night 2016, when the New York Times and every other paper in the country, every other news outlet in the country told us that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And so many of us sat down to watch the returns with that expectation, and the evening turned out quite differently. So at that point, I started to come at the subject from two different perspectives. One was, what was this parallel media system that I found in Oklahoma that was invisible to me in New York? What was it doing? How did it operate? Who was behind it? And the second was, how did the major media that is basically East Coast get it so wrong and have such a misunderstanding of both the US electorate and how the electoral system worked? And so I went and did a deep dive and found that the radio stations I was listening to were run by leading members of something called the Council for National Policy, which very few of my associates had ever heard of. They also hadn't heard of Salem Media, which is one of the largest media conglomerates in the country. and operates thousands of radio stations. And actually, by the time you go back to a lot of schools of journalism and media studies, they don't look at religious broadcasting at all, and much less religious radio. And I could see that it was a major force in the country. So with the help of some brilliant research assistants, I put together the story of this very secretive organization, the Council for National Policy, which brought together big money from fossil fuels interests, and its groups receive funding from the Koch network. Strategists like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich, who are among the founders, grassroots organizations, so-called, although they're not exactly grassroots, who could send out canvassers to knock on millions of doors in critical campaigns. The National Rifle Association is one core member. Another is the Susan B. Anthony organization, which is anti-abortion. And I believe they've been very influential in key campaigns. The case study I use in the book is Claire McCaskill in Missouri. So yes, the book came out and landed quietly because a lot of Washington insiders had one of two answers. One was, I've never heard of them, so it can't be important. Well, it's very secretive. Their membership and their meetings have always been secret. The second answer was, I have heard of them, and therefore it can't be secret. So where that started to change was when the leading members, including the president, Tony Perkins, of the Fundamentalist Family Research Council, started appearing in and out of Trump's White House on a weekly basis. And they were really the people who organized the evangelical vote, which was critical to Trump's election, and then got policy products as the payoff. And one of them was that they provided the list of acceptable nominees for federal courts, including the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing the results in various ways today. And so they became over time more apparent. And then January 6th, they came out of the woodwork and were visibly involved in organizing the protest that became the insurrection. So now the Council for National Policy, which was kind of introduced to the broader public by my book, is being covered by the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Washington Post. And I don't think that the job is nearly done because they're quite active now in various ways, attempting to overturn the midterms and the 2024 elections in ways that are both legal and illegal.
And you're still on the case. This is a article that was published in the New Republic, a rare sneak peek inside the vast right-wing conspiracy. And I just want to scroll through that. I mean, the work you did on this, the documentary work that you have here is incredible. These look like scraps of paper, but this is an annotated look at a number of documents that you were able to get your hands on, notes from a meeting, lists of officers, etc. Can you bring us up to speed on this?
Sure. Yeah, periodically organizations manage to get their hands on the secret membership lists and proceedings. And there are two research organizations in particular. One is the Center for Media and Democracy in Wisconsin, which does great work. And the other is called Documented. And so combining their access to these documents, they post them, but I think that there's such a volume of this material now that people need some help with the analysis. So what I did was dig down into, say, the funding components, and try to draw attention to, say, the Bradley Foundation, which is a key donor to this organization and its operations. The Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee has funded a lot of legal challenges to elections through Cleta Mitchell and other people who were working with Trump to overturn the elections in 2020. The Donors Trust, which is a Trump, a Koch-linked dark money donor consortium, now has its president a member of the CNP. But beyond that, you have to look at the way that they coordinate various activities. So one of their key members is the president of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. And what they do is draft bills such as the so-called heartbeat bills, which impose absolutely draconian measures on abortion, some of which basically condemn pregnant women to death if there's something that goes wrong with their pregnancy. And then they test this in a conservative state, such as my home state of Oklahoma. And then once it passes and it's passed its conservative legal challenge environment, it goes on to other states. So now with these draconian so-called pro-life bills, you have them in a dozen different states. They do that with guns. They do that with, all of their key issues. So that's what I tried to do in this piece, lay out how they function and how they continue to function to erode civil liberties on many fronts.
Absolutely. Definitely a fascinating look. This story, there's another recent story that you had flagged for us. Tell us who George Black is, please.
Well, George Black and I got married over well over 30 years ago. Yeah.
A partner in crime, if you will.
Well, initially we met because we both were experts on death squads in Central America.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess the dating pool for experts in death squads is pretty small then, is that?
And it was before OkCupid, so you work with what you have.
You couldn't filter for that.
Expert, yeah, right. I was expert on Salvadoran death squads and he was expert on Guatemalan death squads. So that's how we met,
a mixed
to our children's eternal chagrin. And over time, I became the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists and went more into the media and freedom of expression space. He became the editor of the Natural Resources Defense Council's magazine On Earth and went more into the environmental space. But I would say that these things converge, right? And as somebody who cares deeply about human rights, I have to care about environment and climate, because that is going to be the ultimate definer of human rights, the human right to life moving forward. And by the same token, as he cares so profoundly about environment, the way that lobbyists and PR firms and bad actors and corporations have crushed information about information is really part of the package that we have to address. And so I think in looking at the current crisis of democracy, our work has converged again, looking at all of these factors.
And I just want to work in that you're both contributors to the Washington Spectator.
We are.
Right.
We are. And we're both contributors to the New Republic as well. But the Washington Spectator has been extraordinary in publishing very detailed and well-sourced studies of these developments and also getting them out quickly, which is extremely important.
Sure.
So the piece that you have up on the screen, which is very current, deals with radically right veterans who are running on a MAGA Trump platform for various congressional and other positions. And they've been presented to their public as, oh, here's a wholesome veteran. Many of them are people of color. Many of them are women. But if you go back and dig down, as George has, and I've helped, into their what they're telling the MAGA community, they're election deniers, right? And they're supporting the most extreme measures introduced by the Republican Party. So if people blindly look at them as moderate Republicans, they're going to be very disappointed if they're elected.
And here is a graphic why there's more to the MAGA movement than white nationalism and gender.
That's right. And one concern that I have is that with all of this emphasis on white supremacy that's coming out of the press and also the Democratic Party, the radical right has an answer to that. They have recruited a whole world of African American and Asian and other minority candidates. So they're in a position to say, oh, who's about white supremacy? We have more people of color than you do. It's just that their candidates will argue for measures that will work in a very serious way against the people they claim to represent.
And we actually had someone on Twitter thank us for sharing this graphic with that article. They didn't know to understand why this there were these yard signs for this Asian American candidate. They didn't understand the reference, so this was helpful for folks.
Yes, anybody who lives in a district that involves one of these candidates, and there's a whole list of them in the article, needs to really tune in and understand exactly what they represent, because their commercials are terrific. They're wonderful commercials, right? It's like, oh, this person will really, represent us in a wholesome way. And it's like, well, yeah, but not if you like democracy.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue into the other topic we want to cover today, Democracy Day, which is an effort to defend our democracy. There are threats, both in terms of an assault on the democracy, but also the democracy itself, but also an assault on the press, which has been ongoing. You have been working on these issues, looking at your book, looking at your research for a number of years in terms of where our society is going, the backsliding that people are writing about now. Can you talk about these issues from that long arc in terms of the work that you've been doing over time?
Yes, I have a somewhat different perspective than many of my colleagues, partly because I grew up in Oklahoma and Nebraska. And I look at it in terms of demographics. What we have is a concentration of population on the East Coast and in urban areas that has accelerated in recent decades, but really since World War II. And you have one political and social culture that has grown up there, and another in the middle of the America, which is often disparaged as the flyover country, which of course people don't appreciate. But it's slower to adjust to these social changes. And so on the one hand, you can have a majority of public opinion as expressed by these urban and coastal populations on abortion and other LGBT issues and so on. And the rest of this country hasn't caught up yet. In the 1960s, you had a court that could impose changes on the rest of this population. Now you don't. And you've got a backlash vote that is still very effective in the Senate, very effective in the Electoral College, that has contributed to this national divide. And to make it worse, the information system based on the journalism that used to reach the middle of the country through local newspapers that carried the Associated Press and the New York Times Syndicate and so on, that has collapsed due mostly to economic and technological reasons. So you have this big part of the country which is now subject to the disinformation systems that have filled that vacuum. And I would point out the Sinclair network, I would point out the Fox News network, and all of these fundamentalist radio and online projects that are just filling the heads of people with disinformation, not just on COVID, but on election denial and on politics and candidates and everything you can name. So we now have a very sharp information divide that I believe is driving a lot of the political conflict.
our friend Deborah Bernick, who's watching, unless she is traveling, is here in Arlington, Virginia. Shocking but useful information need to awaken Americans to the emergency. And Carol King jumped over to LinkedIn. Her name and picture are not coming through for some reason, but I went in and checked. It is Carol. Anne's work here has been groundbreaking and unique in that she can see the realities as someone who has grown up in Oklahoma. So thank you. I want to switch over to the Democracy Day website just to give people that full context, the way that they frame this issue, that we're currently facing an unrelenting assault on our democracy, a clear and present threat to our constitutional rights and our ability as journalists to exist and do our jobs. And as you read on, the threat is not well understood. It's not being treated seriously enough by our elected officials. And in some case, elected officials, read Ron DeSantis, among others, are part of the anti-democratic efforts and aren't being held accountable. This effort is it's an effort to draw attention to the crisis and provide the public with the context and information they need, and to bring all types of media together to sound the alarm collectively. It's there's some really great work. If you look at the partners involved in this effort, you can see we've signed on as a partner, Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along in the top left corner, but another number of other groups, Alaska Public Media, Arizona Papers, and the like. You can see as we scroll through. There are a few that we picked out that we wanted to draw attention to in particular. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, USA Today, WNYC, Chicago Sun-Times, the 19th News Project, the Salt Lake Tribune, which is the T on the right. And then some groups that we've worked closely with, the Center for Cooperative Media, folks may recognize them. They're helping to organize this effort. They also put out the Local Connection newsletter, which we promote every week, and the Center for Public Integrity Solutions Journalism Network. We've produced shows with them. We have a show coming up on Wednesday that we're producing for them. Neiman Reports, Society of Professional Journalists, Online News Association, and even San Francisco Public Press, a college classmate of mine works there, Michael Stoll. So it really is an incredible movement, an incredible effort to bring all of this together. And we want to close, just to kind of give people a little bit more sense of the content that is pushed out. This is a email that the Center for Cooperative Media sent out with links. Media outlets stepped up to educate on Democracy Day, nearly 400 members. And here's a taste of the kind of stories that went out from the Georgia Recorder, Carolina Public Press, Bethesda Beat, Texas Tribune, a whole range of different outlets. So this is something, and the important part, Anne, is that this is not a one-day thing. It's not a focused effort. It's an ongoing effort. It's starting. They have funding for next year. It's an ongoing issue, and we've talked about this on the New York Times Read Along before. Craig Newmark was a guest back in March, I believe, of this year, and we talked about many of the same issues. Ruth Ben-Ghiat was a guest as well back just after the November elections. She wrote a book called Strongmen, which was very timely. So we are certainly supportive of this effort, and but we know that we need to do more collectively, individually, journalists. What is your sense? How do we take this to the next level? What would be the most effective, some of the more effective actions we can take? We have, I think there's a general support in the New York area for these issues and an understanding of the assault on democracy. Where else should we be looking? What else should we be doing to broaden that understanding?
Well, I would disagree with you about the understanding in New York.
Okay.
I think it's a very narrow perspective. which is I mean, everybody's hyper local, right? You know, and it's like my esteemed colleagues from the New York Times who say, oh, the solution is for everyone in Oklahoma City to read the New York Times. And it's like, you know what? They don't really care about the best bagel in Queens. You know,
Sure.
They care about Oklahoma football, and the New York Times doesn't cover that, right? Very often. So I want to go back to that hyper local idea, because a lot of I mean, I'm all in favor of educating Americans about democracy, but I think that for the moment we have to stress how it actually works and not the aspirational ideal. And the aspirational ideal is contained in the word democracy itself, right?
Demos.
This is not a one man or one person, one vote country. It is not. It is like one of the least one person, one vote systems in the Western world. So if you are if you are looking at generic polls, national polls, most Americans support women's right to choose. Well, that's fine, but if it doesn't play out on a state level, you lose. Most Americans support gun control. Same thing. Most Americans in our political system is unfortunately irrelevant. And that is more true now than, you know, in decades. Because right now, the radical right has seized control of the Republican Party, right? You know, a lot of voters in the country think that it's going to the polls and voting for a Democrat versus a Republican. As of this particular period, it's a matter of voting for democracy versus autocracy. Democrats say we should abide by elections. The Republican Party, as seized by the radical right, denies the electoral outcome systematically. And that's part of their platform across the country. It is stated in so many words. And all of their legislative efforts on a state level, a national level, and their legal efforts with the Supreme Court and other federal courts are all to install gerrymandering, voter suppression, and other measures that undermine the vestiges of democracy that are actually functioning in this country. That's their platform. So at this moment, I think that the goal is to look hard at the electoral map. And to do that, I highly recommend the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. Larry Sabato oversees a weekly report on state level races with excellent analysis. And you can find it as Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball. And we have to look at it much more in much more sophisticated terms. So, for example, many of your viewers may not know this, but American democracy may depend on elections like the Arizona state legislature, which the Republicans took by 1,000 votes last time. 1,000 votes. I mean, you know, you can put that in a classroom, right? A large classroom. Same thing with the Pennsylvania governor, right? If the Pennsylvania governor will countenance election suppression and subversion in 2024, the popular vote will matter far less. So it takes that, and in some ways, you know, as I was writing Shadow Network, I thought, all right, the right has offered a blueprint for how to operate in our political system as it exists, not as we'd like it to be. And so they have the big donors talking to the strategists, who talk to the media system, who talk to the canvassers, who share data with all of the above, who put it into their campaign technology and their canvassing apps. And it's a high level of coordination that is also very efficient. And they're willing not to concentrate only on the shiny new toys. So, for example, they invest heavily in radio. And there are many communities, not just rural white communities, but also urban African-American communities where radio is dominant. And they come into these areas and they own the roost because the Democrats and a lot of the elite press have written off radio as a medium of the past. Well, maybe it is for them, but not in these critical electoral districts.
Absolutely.
Where it's a critical source of information for voters who are high propensity voters.
Absolutely. Getting back to the partners in the effort around Democracy Day, Carla Baranakis shares that even Montclair Local, which she is now editing, participated with
Hey,
story about,
Carla.
and Carol Anne wants to give Carla a quick shout out. I'm sorry about the local school board, which stopped posting the minutes of its committee meetings. The board is now going to start posting them again. Great example of hyper local journalism and the importance of local outlets to focus on the school boards and city council, the village councils, etc. That's where you get that. The New York Times is not going to focus on that in that location. I want to get back to a question, a couple other comments that we want to share real quick. Let's see. Rose Horowitz is replying to Carol King, saying that absolutely, as someone who grew up in New York and as a graduate of Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, it's valuable to hear Anne's perspective on the divide and accepting social and cultural in the Midwest and other parts of the country. Deborah Bernick suggests to check out the what is that? The Focus for Democracy, an excellent org for winning swing elections. And Rose quoted Anne saying that it's a matter of voting for democracy rather than autocracy. This is such an important discussion. Absolutely, we couldn't agree with her more. Again, as a reminder, our guest is Anne Nelson. She is an author and research scholar of media analysis at the Saltzman Institute at the School of International and Public Affairs. And she has written a book called Shadow Network, which we want to put on the screen again. Shadow Network is media, money, and the secret hub of the radical right. So let's go ahead and bring Anne back on. Anne, a couple of questions that came in earlier. We want to get back. Diane Stefani had asked what you think of CNN getting rid of reliable sources. That news broke just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, on a Friday. Brian did one last show Sunday morning. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I am very displeased. You know, Brian Stelter has been kind of I would say he has been a unique voice in terms of media analysis. And I don't agree with everything he says, but he's extremely valuable and thoughtful. And, you know, there's a kind of a dark hole in our media culture in terms of analyzing itself. And the idea that a board member like Malone can come in and purge these voices, and it's not just Brian. And you also have others coming into CNN, such as a former correspondent for the Daily Caller, which is actually an outlet that was co-founded by a member of the Council for National Policy with Tucker Carlson. So, you know, I would think one reason that our media culture tolerates right-wing voices, such as the Sinclair and the Fox outlets, is saying, oh, we want diversity. But then if you start having purges in other news organizations to make them more like Fox, it becomes extremely problematic.
I want to share, it's Carol. Again, I checked LinkedIn to make sure, but Carol is saying, and speaking of radio in these rural areas, it's not NPR we're talking about them listening to. Just drive across the country and attempt to hear an NPR station and over Christian news network stations. They dominate the radio dial in these rural areas.
And you know, I would also add to Carol's point that you know, I've kind of experimented with this driving in the Midwest, and what you have is NPR stations. Often they're based in local universities. They're operating on an absolute shoestring budget. And so with their national programming, again, you might have national programming that's very oriented towards the East Coast, which is fine, the coasts, but it may not address local interests, or it may appeal to that same urban university audience that you have otherwise. And by the way, these tend to be the blue islands in the sea of red, or the districts that vote more Democratic than the rest of the state. But as you drive a few miles out of town, the NPR signal fades and fades and fades. And then you just get this smorgasbord of right-wing talk radio, which is associated with the Council for National Policy, the Hugh Hewitts, the Mark Levins, et cetera, along with the fundamentalist radio. And there's a whole economic ecosystem supporting this. So, for example, you will get the Family Research Council and the Leadership Institute buying ads on the Bott radio network, et cetera, and recruiting so-called Christian candidates for public office, saying that your Christian, and meaning fundamentalist faith, should be your qualification for holding elected office. So what you have in these communities is that you go to church and your pastor has been organized into this network. So you get it from the pulpit, you get it voting guides in the church bulletin, literally in the church bulletin telling you how to vote. Then you drive home and it's on the radio. You go home and turn on the television and it's on Christian Broadcasting Network. And then you go on Facebook and you're barraged with Facebook ads, all reinforcing the same points, many of which are falsehoods. So, for example, what you get over and over again is that the Democratic policy, the Democratic Party, is to allow the execution of healthy newborn babies. They say so in so many words, right? This is not true. This is not true.
Of course.
But if you're surrounded by this disinformation and you don't access the corrective reporting that is fact-based, that's what you're going to believe. That's how you vote. And breaking through that wall is incredibly important in these places, right? We don't need to tell people in New York City and San Francisco what's going on. They tend to know.
Sure. A few more comments.
There are many exceptions.
A few more comments that have come in. And Ken says, to your point about ads, he suggested to friends and others that they get their ballot in advance and study carefully each and every candidate. So few people actually do that kind of research and really dig into the candidates, but that's always a good idea. My mom is encouraging, that we should be teaching our children more about democracy and through local and voluntary, through nonprofits as well. We need to start them young, certainly. So before we move on, I just want to remind people, if they're interested in learning more about Democracy Day, you can find them on Twitter, US Democracy Day, at US Democracy Day, or online, usdemocracyday.org, usdemocracyday.org. Deborah is sharing the website for Focus for Democracy. They have a virtual event this evening explaining their work at 8 p.m. tonight. So certainly take a look at that. Deborah Kerr is watching from Pennsylvania, and she's encouraging people to vote early as well. So with that, let's turn our attention to the newspaper. But of course, we're not going to be going too far from the topic. As folks know, if they were watching at the beginning, the display story on the front page is all about the threats to democracy. So let's go ahead and turn our attention there, and we will get the New York Times cam up and running with us in just a bit. Let's see if we can get that. So I'll put you in full screen for just a moment, and we will turn on the camera. So there we go, and we'll put that in the layout. So let's change the layout real quick. Sorry for the reach. There we go. So here is this week's edition of the New York Times, and that front page story on the left: Democracy Challenged, twin threats to governing ideals put America in uncharted territory. we will take a look at this together. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at that article yet, but when you have read it, when you turn inside, you'll see that it takes up 4 pages inside. This is the first jump with the graphic around vote margins, and then another 2 pages here. And I think the pull quote, I think, is very interesting. There is the possibility for the first time in American history that a legitimately elected president will not be able to take office. The point that David is making in this piece, the threats to democracy are not just the questioning of standard norms of election transition, taking the election results, but then also the disconnect between decision making, where you have Democrats have been winning presidential elections, but the Supreme Court is making decisions that'll affect generations. What was your take on the article, Anne?
Well, I think it's overdue. I think the New York Times has been exercising a little more both sidesism than is appropriate in this moment of crisis. So I was very glad to see it. And I also was glad to see that they're speaking in terms of, again, I don't know that Leonard stated it as explicitly as democracy versus autocracy, but he virtually did. Right. I think that it's time for blunt language, but at the same time, it's important to explain it in terms that can reach other populations. So I found when he talked about the 2 dangers, he said the other danger was that the policy making is disconnected from the public values, right? And popular opinion. And that can work 2 ways, because definitely everything that the radical right Republican movement is pushing on abortion, on gun control, on climate, runs counter to public opinion in this country. But I do feel that the Democrats have also been tone deaf to the public opinion on other issues. And so there are legitimate complaints about economic policy, trade policy, how we deal with labor and other issues, where the Democrats could do a lot better in terms of listening and dialogue, especially in parts of the country where they're losing strength, like the industrial northern states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. So I will say that I always appreciate good infographics, and I thought this piece did very well on that count.
Talking about the infographics, we'll put that into the bigger square. Presidential appointments of Supreme Court justices. We have this one I thought was particularly interesting. State legislators and election lines. The share of Republican state legislators who have taken steps as of May 2022 to discredit or overturn the 2020 presidential election results. Arizona, 81% of Republicans. Wisconsin, 73%. Pennsylvania, 78%. It gets smaller in Michigan, 48%, 23% in Georgia, only 4% in Nevada, which I thought was interesting in terms of the percentage of Republicans who are trying to discredit or overturn the election results. Rose quotes you saying it's time for blunt language but explains in terms that everyone can understand. And Miriam says, thank you, Anne, for all of your work in revealing and explaining what is going on in this country. We have several people giving shout outs to local radio. So we'll just go back to that real quick. Pradnia gave a shout out to WUKY. And Paula gave a shout out to WFSU, both presumably college-based public media stations in Kentucky and Florida I know that the second one is Florida, certainly. But this definitely is interesting. And I think that there are secretaries of state, if I'm not mistaken, on the ballot who would be responsible for overseeing the 2024 elections, who are themselves election deniers. That is just an incredible possibility that you would have someone in that position questioning what many of us, I'll say us, but many others just take for granted. When you get election results, you have a clear winner. It's not clear for everyone, unfortunately, which is very surprising.
Well, and again, in our system, Hillary Clinton obviously won 3 million more popular votes than Trump and lost the Electoral College. She conceded, but I think that was cognitive dissonance for a lot of Democrats.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's take a look at what else is in the front page section of the paper. The U.S. vowed to stabilize Central America. Life is only worse. Migrants still fleeing as autocrats thrive. Above, this picture is of a protest against corruption outside the Guatemalan parliament. Here's a picture of Vice President Kamala Harris in Guatemala last year describing a new U.S. approach to migration. And then below, Rafael, I can't pronounce the last name, a top anti-graft official in Guatemala, is on a U.S. list of officials harming democracy. We always like to pay attention to the ads in the paper, especially because we're looking at the print edition. You don't see this online in the same way. Uniqlo, the activewear brand, has an open letter to Roger Federer, congratulating him on his retirement and thanking him for his career. Very well done, very understated full-page ad. This is ongoing coverage of the Queen's, not quite the funeral, I think the service is tomorrow, but bouquets, condolences, and nonstop scrutiny. Torrent criticism greets Meghan in UK. So they're focusing on Meghan instead of the Queen, unfortunately. This is more international coverage of Ukraine. Biden warns a reeling Russia not to use unconventional weapons. And here's an interesting ad for crossword fans. For the immunocompromised community, the pandemic has led to a lot of questions around everyday life. Now there may be a better solution for COVID-19 prevention. I'm looking at, it looks like a standard crossword. I don't see, but it's a COVID, administered through needle injections. And let's see what else. A few other hospital employees administering some shots, secondary shot in the arm down here. So that's an interesting approach. Again, and it's actually a 2-page ad. The left is not everyone understands what immunocompromised people are going through right now. An open letter from Jeff Bridges, the actor. Old Man is a great show if folks are into that kind of action, adventure, CIA-focused thrillers. But that's an interesting piece. So here we're getting into, we're still in international coverage. Here's a national look. Abortion fight gives conservatives an opening in Puerto Rico. That's not what you would think. They said 3 years ago, after Puerto Rico's legislature narrowly defeated new abortion restrictions, the cardiologist and pastor, Dr. Cesar Vasquez Muniz, founded a new political party whose mission he vowed would include defending life. So that's interesting that they have an opening. It's actually Democrats that are seeing an opening in the rest of the mainland because of the abortion decision. Well, this is the election article we talked about, the democracy article. This is a piece, this was on the front page, the city that never sleeps now nods off a bit early, about New York. And then the other article off the front page, Hispanic voters still lean Democratic despite GOP inroads, poll finds. So a nice infographic again. You might want to take a closer look at this later. While most Hispanic voters plan to vote for Democrats in November, in this year's election for Congress were held today, which party's candidate would you be more likely to vote for in your district? So they kind of break that down. The blue line is Democrats, more than 50%. And several other questions that they posed there. So, Anne, when you read the New York Times, what do you go to next? What's your what section do you prefer?
Oh, I have my dessert first. I look at the magazine.
Go right
well,
to
no,
the magazine.
I look at the front page, then the
after
magazine,
the front page,
then the book review, and then I kind of work my way through the rest of the paper. I read a lot of it online, so I read the Leonard piece before.
Sure.
And I think you're right that you do lose something reading something online because you lose the context and the layout and the ads. So I still get the paper on weekends, but not during the week. Which, I find the delivery system a little confusing because I don't always know what I've already read that's going to be in the paper when it comes.
It's interesting actually to think about as far as the delivery over the weekend is concerned. They distribute about half the paper on Saturday with the Saturday bundle that are Sunday sections. They did that because it used to be too heavy to deliver everything on Sunday, so they broke it up a little bit. But what we've seen is the differential between when an article goes online and when it's in print. And we've worked closely with the print folks at the New York Times and some of the writers. They're on different schedules. They put something online when it's ready to go online. Of course, the magazine goes up midweek or so. But if it's the right timing to put it online, they'll do that. But it may not be the right timing for print. If it's a special section, if it's a special report, they'll hold it a week or 2 weeks. They actually held a special report on the 125th anniversary of the book review last fall. We had did a special edition. Tina Jordan was our guest, the deputy editor, and there was an article about the haunts of authors in New York City, kind of over time, historical haunts. That didn't see a print version for almost 8 or 9 months. It was an evergreen story, but it came out later. You mentioned you like to have your dessert first and go to the magazine. Ron DeSantis for dessert? I'm not quite sure that. That's still pretty heavy, right?
Yeah.
This week, at least. Ellen has a comment. She understands how the Electoral College works, but we have to get people to understand we don't live in a one-vote democracy. How do you feel about changing our system from the Electoral College, et cetera? What are your thoughts on the Electoral College?
Oh, I think that both the Electoral College and the Senate need reform to make them more representative of the population. The problem is that that's not going to happen next year, and it's not going to happen before 2024. Mm-hmm. And basically, one of the partners of the Council for National Policy is Hillsdale College, and they have a 6 million circulation publication called Imprimis, as well as an online so-called educational system. And they're just pumping out stuff to their audience in the millions about how we have to preserve the Electoral College because that's what the founders wanted, blah, blah, blah. So this is going to be another area of contention. And we're going to have to live with the system that exists until there is the political weight in Congress and the White House and the courts to reform it. And that's not going to be tomorrow.
And Ellen agrees we do need reform of these systems. So let's turn our attention to dessert. Ron DeSantis. We did use a picture of Ron DeSantis in our promo video when we talked about politicians that were part of the problem, that were standing in the way. What's your take on the governor of Florida?
Well, he's a piece of work. I think he's a more, to many, he's a more acceptable form of Trump. But he had been appearing as Trump's sidekick for a while, and now he's moving into the position of Plan B. One characteristic is that he is charismatically challenged in the same way that I believe Ted Cruz is. He has low name recognition. And also, he has appealed to the Cuban exile community in Florida as becoming more and more vocally conservative. And I find the idea of his deporting Venezuelan exiles from, refugees from the Venezuelan dictatorship to Massachusetts to be utterly cynical and cruel and just a very low form of politics.
Yeah. Here's
deporting anybody in that way would be horrible.
I'm sorry, say that again.
An abuse of their rights. But again, to be playing to this exile audience and then treating people so shamefully is a level of hypocrisy that is really extraordinary, even in his circles.
Sure. Going back to that, the cover on the design of the cover, they use that at a Trump rally as well. They used a full page image of DeSantis over a picture of Trump, and they have more pictures of Trump and DeSantis together. And let's see what else. Again, doing that.
And in my book, I really make the point that Trump was not the driver of this movement. He was the circles around the Council for National Policy accepted him as an instrument of their movement. And it is my belief that they would happily, especially now, they would happily discard him if they had a better option.
Well, they got what they wanted, right? They held their nose. I mean, he was a vehicle for them.
Well, yeah, they got what they wanted until he lost in 2020.
Sure.
And what they wanted to do was consolidate their power for the foreseeable future. And now that question is back in play. I keep saying that if this were a chess match, this would be the end game.
Got it. So setting the magazine aside, now that you've had dessert, what's on tap? We only have a few more minutes with you, at least get a sense of what else you would be looking at.
Yeah, frankly, I wasn't that taken by the book review section this week. However, I've the director of Hamilton also directed my play, The Guys. So I've followed Hamilton since its cradle.
Absolutely.
And I'm also currently preparing the paperback edition of my book about the anti-Nazi resistance in Germany. It's called Red Orchestra. It'll be out next year. So as it happens, this week I've been buried in German. So for the benefit of your listeners, if you want to say, I'm not throwing away my shot in German, you say, Mann, ich habe nur diesen einen Schuss.
Let's show that, put that on screen and read that out.
Mann, ich habe nur diesen einen Schuss.
Great.
And I do think that the Germans are very focused on our crisis of democracy, given what they've gone through. They've got a very sharp perspective, and they're frankly aghast at what's happening to our political system, given what they've lived through.
Sure. And it really, to me, it harkens back to Sinclair Lewis. It can't happen here, right?
Really and everybody should go back and read the Sinclair Lewis called "It Can't Happen Here" because it speaks powerfully to what we're living through now.
It really does. I mean, the whole premise was that no one would assume that the U.S. could sink to those depths, but we came really close January 6th, and that fight is not over yet, I think, by any means. Here is a back page ad, again, something that we wouldn't necessarily see online, depending on what the online advertising strategy is. But Ken Burns has a new documentary out, The U.S. and the Holocaust, History to be Reckoned With, is the tagline at the bottom. Steven Spielberg's quote, "The most powerful narrative yet achieved, in my humble opinion." And coming from Steven Spielberg, that's saying something. So it premieres tonight at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on PBS, The U.S. and the Holocaust.
I also recommend to your readers the PBS series, The Rise of the Nazis, seasons 1 and 2, which is still on the PBS website. And I think that in terms of showing the political trajectory that we need to understand, it's very powerful.
Ellen makes a reference to that book, Red Orchestra, as opposed to White Rose. I'm in Germany during the war. Nice. She likes that. That's another book that you wrote, right?
That's the one that I'm preparing the new paperback edition for.
The new paperback.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So we are coming toward the end of another show. We want to, again, make sure folks know the Sunday Opinion, business. We weren't able to get to everything, but we did have a really great conversation with Anne. And what we're going to do is give you a break. We're going to take you off screen for a moment and then ask you to come back with a final thought about shadow networks and also a pro tip for journalists, what your advice for them would be. And we'll go ahead and make a few quick announcements of our own while you think that through. The first thing we want to do is to thank our production team. Of course, Sri Srinivasan is our host. I am the executive producer, occasional guest host. He and I get most of the airtime, but Paula Kiger is working hard behind the scenes on Facebook and on LinkedIn, providing context for the show. So big shout out to Paula for all the work that she does. You can follow her at Big Green Pen, at Big Green Pen. We also want to thank our sponsor, Muckrack, longtime sponsor of Sri's shows. And they just got some significant VC funding, $180 million worth. So congratulations to Muckrack on that. We are thrilled for your success. The Sunday New York Times Read Along is produced by Digimentors. It's a production company and consulting firm that Sri is the co-founder of. We produce high-quality virtual and hybrid events for organizations big and small around the world. If you're interested in working with us, please send us an email. You can reach Sri at digimentors.group, and you can reach me, Neil, at digimentors.group, and we would love to talk with you. We also want to give a shout out to the Local Connection newsletter put out by the Center for Cooperative Media, one of the organizers behind Democracy Day. The Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University brings you the Local Connection newsletter, and each week it offers story ideas and pro tips for journalists. Best of all, it's free. You can subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips, bit.ly/local news tips. And as a heads up for next week, we are running a ticker across the bottom earlier if you happen to see it. Our next week's guest is actually from Europe. Alia Papageorgiou is the president of the press club of Brussels, Europe, and she will be our guest. She's also the vice president of the Association of European Journalists. So we're looking forward to having her get a different perspective on the news. And we also want to remind folks that if you did join us late, you can watch the show on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, as soon as the show is over, you'll be able to watch on the same links just a few minutes after we're done. So make sure, in case you missed the opening conversation with Anne or the conversation about the book, we certainly want to encourage you to do that. We want to share a few more comments from folks that came in while we were talking. Ellen said the EC, Electoral College, was what the founders wanted, obviously, but it is now 2022, and the founders didn't foresee whatever would become and what we have become. Absolutely. We certainly agree with that. Let's see. She's saying that hopefully this latest Hispanic move will turn many in Florida towards the Democrats. We certainly can hope so, only hope so. Zaheda says, thank you to all. Thank you, Zaheda. And again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing. Patricia Freudenberg also says, thank you to the entire production team and special guest Anne for a great conversation. Let's see, what other comments did we have? If we missed anything during the show, want to give a shout out. Jennifer Dorr was saying hi to folks watching on Facebook. Thank you, Jennifer. Let's see, earlier in the conversation, we had some comments about vaccines that we didn't get to. Miriam said, I completely agree about the vastly larger number of deaths from COVID that we can't blame outside terrorists. Those deaths are because of Americans, including the ones that the others that died. My mom says misinformation about vaccine and treatment of COVID was spread by President Trump. Many people followed those unscientific information and succumbed with COVID and died. So with that, we'll bring Anne back on and ask her to give a final thought on her book, Shadow Network, and also to give a pro tip to journalists. So with that, we welcome back Anne Nelson. Anne, thank you for joining us. Portrait view this time, which is great. So a final thought in your book, Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right, with incredible blurbs from Timothy Snyder and Nancy McLean. A final thought on your work and your perspective on the issues we covered today.
Yeah, I feel as though my communities on the East Coast and also on the West Coast are still responding to the performative politics of the past, marches, statements, etc. And those are not working. That's the lesson of the Council for National Policy. What they do is relational politics, connective politics. And if we want to unite this country and sustain any form of democracy, that's what we have to do. We have to connect. We have to listen. We have to understand. We have to amplify the concerns and the worries and the hardships of people who don't live in our community. And if you look down on them, they're going to be understandably alienated from your point of view. So I think that in general, if you read my book, that's the underlying message. This country, united we stand, divided we fall. In terms of journalism, the tip that I learned, not just in this case, but in my travels through Latin America and elsewhere, is that if you want to go to learn about another community, one thing you can do is go to church. I've been to every kind of religious service, from the Buddhists in Vietnam to synagogues to Catholic services in Quechua in Peru, and they tend to be very welcoming of people who are not of their faith or of no faith. And in those conversations, you learn something profound about a community that is hard to learn anywhere else.
Thank you very much. That's really great. I want to, one of the announcements that I forgot to mention, if you bear with us for just a moment, Anne, our colleague Rose Horowitz is celebrating the 1-year anniversary of her Women to Follow show. And you are certainly a woman to follow on Twitter. You can follow Anne at @NelsonA on Twitter. Rose is focusing on the secret sauce, succeeding in social media, podcasts, and TV production. Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, she'll have Jennifer Navarrete, a podcast producer. She'll have Gia El Hassan, an entrepreneur and marketing specialist and clinical dietitian. And she'll also have Indra Bartona, a film and TV producer, founder of the Positivity Vibe Tribe community on Twitter. So please join her on Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Rose, congratulations on 1 year. It is a huge milestone, and we certainly appreciate everything that you've brought to our conversations. With that, Anne, we want to thank you again for joining us. This has been a great conversation, both very timely in terms of Democracy Day, and fitting right in line with your work and your research over the years. For everyone who's watching, again, as soon as we are off the air, if you missed the beginning, you'll be able to go back and watch it. Carla, it gives a great to see you, Anne. So we want to give you a quick shout out. And my mom also, very good guest from her alma mater. She did social work at Columbia University.
Right.
She graduated in May, and I was born in June, just a month later. So thank you for that. Rose says, so enlightening to hear Anne's discussion and the importance of the Religious Right Radio. So with that, thank you for joining us, and hope you have a great Sunday. We'll see you again next week. Take care.